All right, so turn to Judges 15 as we keep walking through the book of Judges, and we got 2 more weeks of Samson to learn from. If you're just joining us, Samson's mom and dad were visited by an angel of the Lord and said that he is going to be a Nazirite from birth, set apart for God's purposes, and that he had specific things that he was supposed to follow as he walked out that vow. And last week we realized he's not doing a very good job of fulfilling his vow, but God is always faithful. And so in verse 4 of Judges 15, it said that the Lord was using everything that Samson was doing. Let me find it. As an opportunity against the Philistines. And so even though Samson's doing his own thing, God is still bigger than that, and he's accomplishing his purposes through Samson. And so we talked about last week that we can't miss God's will if we're seeking God's will, and even if we're not seeking God's will is still going to be accomplished. It's whether we're going to be in part of it and used by God to accomplish his will, or whether we're going to do our own thing. And in doing that, most of the time, all the time, if we're doing our own thing, we're going to experience the consequences of not falling into God's plan. And today we're going to see some of those consequences unfold of Samson doing his own thing. And so we left off last week. Samson lost the riddle bet to his 30 attendants at his wedding. He storms off. He goes down to Ashkelon. He kills 30 Philistines to get their changes of clothes and their linen garments. He brings them back to his attendants. He throws them down. He gives he pays basically his due about his bet that he lost, and then he storms back to his mom's and his dad's house. And it ended off saying that Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. And so that's a great wedding celebration, huh? Most of it was spent in tears. And then at the end, Samson storms off, doesn't consummate the marriage, goes back to his mom and dad's house, and her dad's standing there going, well, I guess I'll give her to his best man, because that's the culture, unbeknownst to Samson. And so Samson's going to get a rude awakening in chapter 15 when he comes back to consummate the marriage to his wife that he bailed on. All right? So thank you guys for doing it right. And we're going to learn how Samson did it wrong. All right, so verse 1. After some days at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. And he said, I will go in to my wife in the chamber. But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, I really thought that I really hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be innocent in regards to the Philistines when I do them great harm. And so Samson, again, approaches the dad, says, I'm back. Here's my little peace offering of a young goat because I made such a fool of myself. And the dad's like, dude, I thought you hated her. And I passed her on to the best man because that's what we do. And you left her hanging at the altar. And you didn't consummate the marriage. And you didn't fulfill the marital vows. And so she's no longer available. But consolation prize, I have a younger daughter, and she's more beautiful than the older daughter, and so won't you just take her? We'll call it a draw, and we'll just move on from here. And Samson, in Samson style, went crazy mad. Why? Because the younger daughter was not right in his own eyes. It was the older daughter that was right in his own eyes, and he's stuck on it, and regardless of how much he had to play into the mess up, which was like 99%, he's like going to take it now out on the Philistines. And he says, this time I shall be innocent in regards to the Philistines when I do them great harm. And so his wheels are already spinning of how he can avenge this marital mess up. Now, where's God in this? Well, you got to look and say, God says he's going to use all this, right? And even in Samson's crazy anger going home and not consummating the marriage, God's protecting Samson because what's God's perfect will for Samson? To marry a Philistine who's an enemy of Israel? No. And so even in Samson's anger and his rash decisions, God is still going to use it to protect him from marrying into the enemy camp. Because he's supposed to be delivering Israel from the nation of, or from the people of Philistines, not intermarrying with them and not allying himself with them. And so God is going to use this to let him step back and instead of marrying into the Philistine family, continue the purpose that God has for him to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. All right, so let's keep going. So in verse 4, Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches, and he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. All right, you got a visual? 300 foxes, pairing them up one to one, taking their tails, wrapping them together, putting a torch in the wrapped up, braided tail. All right? And then in verse 5, he went and set fire to the torches. Now you got a visual, right? 2 foxes tied together by their tails with a torch that is now lit. They're not going to lay down. And he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines. All right, that was a harvested grain that had already been harvested, because what time of year is it? It's the wheat harvest. So this is like right after all the grain's been taken from the fields and it's been gathered together. So he first sets them into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. And so now you got this picture of 300 foxes, 150 pairs, running through the standing grain that's been harvested, the grain that hasn't been harvested in the fields, and also into the olive orchards to burn down all the olive trees. Not a good plan for the Philistines. Verse 6, the Philistine says, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. All right, so Samson's like, I'm going to be innocent of blood. I'm going to avenge the marriage that didn't take place. He gets the foxes. He sets fire to all their grain, all their olive orchards, everything that they've harvested for the year. And now the Philistines are like, what just happened? We just lost everything that we need for the next year. And word gets around, it was Samson. And the reason he did it is because Dad gave his wife that he bailed on to the best man, offered the younger sister, and Samson wouldn't have it, and he destroyed all of our stuff. So just like a good Philistine would, they go to the father's house, and they burn his house with fire, and they destroy the daughter that was supposed to be married to Samson in the first place. Man, great neighbors, huh? Why did the wife last week betray Samson to the 30 young attendants and give the riddle to them so that Samson lost the bet and they wouldn't lose the bet? The only reason she did it is to spare herself and her father from fire that the 30 attendants said, if you don't tell us the riddle, we're going to destroy your house with fire and all your family. And guess what ends up happening? The same exact thing she was trying to prevent from happening in the first place. Why? Because that kind of sin will always find us out. We can't play with that. We're going to reap that. And so even in her trying to spare her people and trying to spare her family, this evil of the Philistines, we kind of get a picture of them and how they operate. They turn on the family, they destroy the house, they destroy the father, they destroy the wife. And in verse 7, Samson then avenges that. So you see how evil becomes evil, becomes evil, becomes evil? So now in verse 7, Samson is declaring more evil upon him. And Samson said to them, those that burned her house and her father and the wife, he said, if this is what you do, if this is how you operate, if this is how you are a good neighbor to one another, I swear I will be avenged on you. And after that, I will quit. So Samson's like, I got one more avenging ramification, and then I'm going to release this. But God had other plans. And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow and went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Edom. So Samson basically unleashes on these Philistines that burned the house down. It doesn't say how many he unleashed on. It doesn't say how it went down. It just gives us this hip and thigh with a great blow thing. And some people go, he piled up the bodies to hip and thigh. Other people go, we're not really sure what it means. But all we do know is Samson avenged the death of his wife that wasn't consummated, her household. And he said, I won't be held accountable for this because basically they get what they deserve. They're sowing what they reaped. But after he avenges her death and her family's death, he then goes and hides out in a cave in Edom. So now, are the Philistines going to lay down and die? No, they're the oppressors. They're the rulers. They're the ones in authority over Israel at this point. And so Philistines finds out that the hip and thigh event went down with Samson, and he's escaped to Edom. So they're going to rally up a group because now they've got to repay evil for evil because we got to keep this thing going, right? Because that's how they're rolling. And so the Philistines in verse 9 came up, and they encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. So they get a group of men together, an army, and they come up and they're like, we can't find Samson, but we know he's up here somewhere. So they go to Judah, who is close by, the tribe of Judah, in Lehi. And the men of Judah say, why have you come up against us? The Philistine says, we have come up to bind Samson to do to him as he did to us. And so here you get this avenging coming back and forth. So the guys in Judah just want to lay low. But now the army of Philistines come up against them and said, basically, we're looking for Samson, and you got to help us out. So then 3,000 men of Judah, in verse 11, went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? So whose side are the Judah guys on? They're on the Philistine side. The Philistines have come to Judah and they say, look, we're looking for Samson. He's destroyed our fields. He's destroyed all of our harvested grain. He's destroyed our olive orchards. And we're here to avenge all that. Give us Samson. So 3,000 Judah guys assemble and they go up to the cleft of Edom because they know where he's at. And their first thing out of their mouth is, what are you doing? Don't you know the Philistines rule over us? Think about it. To get into a situation where Judah is okay with the Philistines coming to destroy Samson and not do anything about it, says a lot about the state they're in. Now, they had gone through the cycles, right? They had gone through the cycles of worshiping God, letting a time of peace go by. Then they get drifted off. They start worshiping idols and the false gods of the land. And then the oppressors come because God hands them over to their enemies. And then they get so oppressed that they call out in misery to God. And God hears their cry and he delivers them through a judge. And now Israel has gotten to a point where Judah, the warring tribe of Israel, is basically looking at Samson going, why are you causing trouble for us? What are you doing? Because they had laid down and said, Philistines are the oppressors of us. They're the rulers over us, and we don't want to shake status quo. We don't want to mess up and rock the boat here. So why don't you stop doing what you're doing? Samson's response to them in verse 11, he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. All right, that's like a 2-year-old response, right? Hey, I'm just doing what they did to me. I'm just returning what happened. He hit me, she hit me, I hit her. We just kept it going. Verse 12, they said to him, we have come down to bind you that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. So basically now they're being honest with him, saying, look, the only reason we're here and the reason there's 3,000 of us is because our intent is to take you from the cleft of Edom down to the Philistines and hand you over to them. Basically, they're like, we're here to turn you over to our enemies. Somebody said, the Israelites didn't think too much about rebelling against God, but they sure are having a hard time rebelling against the Philistines. Wow. And when they came up to Samson, if they had been in tune anywhere with what God was doing, right, they would have looked to Samson and said, hey, rally us. There's 3,000 of us. We're going to find out in a little bit there's not that many Philistines. And they should have looked to Samson for leadership and for guidance, but they weren't. Why weren't they? Because Samson was doing his own thing. He's running a one-man band at this point. And so Samson's not looking to lead Israel, although he's been called to be a deliverer of Israel. He's called to judge Israel. He hasn't accepted that yet. And so now he's out doing his own thing, and he's returning trade for trade, avenge for avenge with with the Philistine people, while Israel sits by and basically watches. And so Israel's not rising to the occasion. Samson's not rising to the occasion. And yet God says, it's okay, I'm still going to get my will accomplished. My plan is still going to be accomplished, despite you guys. And so they say straight up to him, look, we are here to bind you and to hand you over to the Philistines. And Samson's response is not, I'm going to kill you guys. Samson's response is in verse 12, swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves. The whole dead or alive thing, Samson's like, just promise me you're going to deliver me alive. So they said to him in verse 13, no, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will surely not kill you. Now, isn't that great to hear from your friends? I'm not going to kill you. I'm just going to bind you really well and hand you over to the Philistines and let them kill you. So they're off scot-free. They're like, hey, no harm, no foul. We did what we're supposed to do. We just want to get back to status quo. We just want to get back to the Philistines leaving us alone, and even though they're oppressing us and ruling over us, we're okay with that. But God's not. And so they bind him with 2 new ropes, and they bring him up from the rock. So now you got 3,000 men of Judah leading Samson bound with 2 new ropes with his hands bound. And he's bringing him out of the cleft of Edom down to the Philistines. And when the Philistines see him in verse 14, man, they throw a party. In verse 14, it says, when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Now, that word just doesn't do any justice. So let's dig a little bit. They see Samson bound with ropes. They see 3,000 guys from Judah leading him in procession, and they deliver them into the hands of the Philistines, and the Philistines are sitting there, and they're shouting, they're hooping, they're hollering, they're doing the war chant, they're doing the victory dance, they're doing everything that they can, because now, finally, Samson's going to be delivered into their hands, and they're going to destroy him, and they're going to avenge it once and for all. After Samson says, I'm going to do one more thing, and then I'm done with you guys. The Philistines says, we're not done until you're dead. And now they've got him right exactly where they want him. And they see that his people are not going to defend him. So they know that they've broken Israel's spirit. They know they've got their enemy exactly where they want him to be. And the only chance of them being delivered from their hand is bound in front of them. And so they start shouting and running to meet him. But God. But the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson, and the ropes were on his arms became as flax as that had caught fire, and the bonds melted off his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone, not a rotten one, and put out his hand and took it, and with it struck 1,000 men. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, and with the jawbone of a donkey I have struck down 1,000 men. And as soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand at the place called Ramah Lehi. And so everything that the Philistines thought was going to be accomplished to destroy Samson, God completely thwarted in an instant. Because immediately God's Spirit empowered Samson to just completely break off the bonds. And he grabbed whatever was close by. It was a fresh jawbone. And he struck down the 1,000 Philistines in front of the 3,000 Judah guys. And then he makes a little poem up, because that's how good Samson is. Last week he had a little riddle for the winning attendance. This time he writes a quick poem. He probably sings it. And he finished singing or speaking. He throws the jawbone down. And he calls the place Jawbone Hill. How? Only because of God. Only because God's Spirit empowered him to save him and save the people of Judah and to begin the deliverance of what God had in store for the nation of Israel. Despite the fact that they've completely surrendered to their enemy. And so we think we've got a little victory dance going on for the people of Judah, but apparently they bail on him. You would think right there the light bulb would kind of go on and they'd be like, wow, God just delivered Samson from the hands of 1,000 Philistines. Here we are 3,000. Maybe we should unify. Maybe we should form and see what God's doing through Samson. But the truth of the matter is they just kind of vaporize, because Samson's next statement is all about him being alone and where's God in this. So the people of Judah don't stick around for the celebration. They completely bail on him. And the celebration that Samson had is quickly dissolved because he realizes something's going on with him. So in verse 18 it says, he was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, You have granted this great salvation by my hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? And so Samson goes from the victory of killing all these Philistines with the jawbone, he throws the jawbone, and then he realizes, I'm thirsty and I'm going to die of thirst. God, are you seriously going to let me die of thirst and fall into the hands of these uncircumcised Philistines after all you've done for me? And maybe after all I've done for you? And he becomes completely entrenched in his physical needs to the point where it's good that he's calling out to God. It's crazy that he's so concerned about his thirst that that's the very first thing he thinks about. But he does, in a little bit of hope, say, God, you're the one that really did deliver me from the hands of the Philistines. And so we got to at least give him that part. But at this point, he's basically turning on God going, are you seriously going to let me die of thirst? Doesn't that remind you of the Israelites after they led in the wilderness? Man, yeah, God parted the waters of the Red Sea, and God did all these great things, and he's provided for us up to here, but, we're getting sick of water, we're getting sick of manna, and we haven't drank for a long time. God, are you seriously going to let us die of thirst in the wilderness? Wouldn't it be better if we went back to Egypt? And Samson kind of finds himself in the same place. And so you put yourself in God's shoes. What would you do at this point with Samson? You're wringing your hands and you're like, ugh, you're killing me, dude. But what's God do? In his graciousness, in his faithfulness, in his plan. Verse 19, God splits open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. Because that's how good God is. Samson's doing a raging fit about how God's going to let him die of thirst, and God's response is, drink out of that rock. I'm a provider of all things. Because I'm a good God. And despite you and your temper tantrum and you having to do it your own way, despite the fact that you still haven't grasped this Nazirite vow, despite the fact that you haven't grasped the fact that I've called you to lead the nation of Israel and be their deliverer and be their judge, you haven't passed in all that. And yet, because I'm a gracious and long-suffering God and because I have a plan for you, I'm going to strike the rock and it's going to open up in a hollow and there'll be water flowing from you. And Samson's like, finally, water. And when he drank from it, his spirit returned and he revived. And therefore the name of it is called En-Hakor, that is in Lehi to this day. And then the PS is, Samson judged Israel in the days of the Philistines for 20 years. So Samson calls upon God. God supernaturally answers Samson's prayer and provides for what he needs. And Samson calls the place the caller's spring, or the spring of one who calls, or the spring of one who prays. Because Samson had a need, and he was focused on that need, and God says, here's a way to reveal myself to my child, and he meets that need. Now, hopefully he connected the dots of God's power empowering him to slay the Philistines in the first place, but even if he's taking credit for that, he can't deny God's hand in providing water for him and him receiving that from the Lord. And this is the first time we actually see in Samson's life him calling out to God in the first place. Now, I believe he probably heard from God before this, but it's the first time it's recorded that he actually called upon God. But the cool thing is, because of this exchange between him and God, he's completely understanding now that God supernaturally provided for him. And we're thinking, maybe here's the turning point, right? Maybe now he's going to be like, okay, God, I'm going to live for you, and I'm going to do it your way now from here on out, and we'll find out next week if that's true. But the truth of the matter is, up until this point, he's been doing his own thing, and Israel's nowhere in the picture to be delivered and be the people that they've been called to be. And it seems like every time Philistine has some success against Samson, God opens up the door for the Philistines to be destroyed by Samson. Because the whole purpose of God bringing Samson into the picture was to begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines, which was a long process. You think about, man, little David with his sling and bow, or sling and stone, we're still battling the Philistines. But God's begun something with Samson that only God's going to be able to finish. So let me ask y'all a question as I've been kind of chewing on this week. in what areas of our life, last week we said, we got to see what we're holding on to, because that's us. We're holding on to different things, and we're like, oh, God, don't mess with this. Just let me hold on to this. And it's like my little comfort zone or my little thing that I want to be able to do. And God goes, could you just release that to me and see what I can do with that? But this week, think about the nation of Israel and their status quo. And we like status quo. Visionaries, not so much. But us normal people, we like status quo because we get into the groove, we put it on cruise control, and we say, don't mess with my status quo. Regardless of how dysfunctional our status quo is. And that's where Israel found themselves. They're like, we're under the oppression of the Philistines. We know it. We know it's not God's best for us. It's not even in his plan. And yet, they're leaving us alone. Don't rock the boat. Let us do our own thing. Let them do their own thing. And we'll live like this until we die, and we'll call it a day. And they forgot all the promises that God had for them before they got into the promised land of when you get there, you will be your own nation. You will be independent. You will have all the land. You will have all the things that I promised you. And yet they didn't do what God asked them to do, and now they're finding themselves oppressed by the Philistines. And yet they're okay with it. And so what areas of our life are we just kind of like mundane about and okay with, even though we know it's not God's best for us? Because it's safe, or it's not hurting anybody. And God says, man, that's not anywhere close to where I want you to be. And yet we kind of just keep walking it out. And sometimes we say, God, don't even mess with that. Like, I know it's messed up, but just don't mess with that. And God says, I want you to completely surrender that, because that's the only way I'm going to be able to accomplish all that I want to accomplish. Samson tried to marry into the Philistines, and you can't blame him because the Israelites had already submitted themselves to him anyway. And God says, I want my people, like Samson, called out for a purpose and walking in my ways, not the ways of the world. And so this week, I just want you to spend a little time with God and say, God, what have I settled for status quo-wise? It could be relationships. It could be you sharing the gospel with somebody. Oh, I've done that. And I'm okay with where they're at because, you know what, I've tried. And God's like, no, I want you to renew your fervor, renew your call, renew what I've put on your heart for that person, and don't stop praying, don't stop sharing, stop doing what I've called you to do. It could be something within ministry that God's called you to, and you're like, you know what, it's just not working out. I think I'm just going to put it on the shelf. And God's like, I want you to keep going and keep persevering and keep walking this out with me, because I got a plan through this. Not that it's going to go easy. So all the things Samson's done up until this point looks like it's for Samson, but God is going to even use that. And so you just look at it and say, what am I doing that I think I'm just doing? And how can I see God in it? And maybe it'll shift the way I'm doing it, because God's got a different purpose in that. Samson got to the place where he was desperate and he just called out to God. I'm going to encourage you not to wait till you're desperate. Or maybe you're frustrated because you've been calling out to God and God doesn't seem to be answering it the way you do, but I want to encourage you to just keep calling out to God. And maybe start with that verse, behold the Lamb of God who takes away our sins. And then let your prayer follow that, because hopefully that'll change the way you're looking at the issue you're looking at. Let's pray together.